Everything was about to fall apart, and she had no idea. The clock struck 11 o'clock at night when the message was sent, "It's all over between us." At that very moment, she was with him. Laughing, whispering secrets into her lover's ear, completely oblivious to the fact that her life was about to turn upside down. The smile on his lips disappeared as soon as his cell phone vibrated on the table. Those words, simple and direct, brought a reality that she was not ready to face. She felt the ground open beneath her feet, her heart race, and the bitter taste of fear rise to her throat. For months, she lived a lie, a double life, believing she was in control, believing the game was stacked in her favor. But now, all of that was about to explode. She despairs, imagining the consequences. Everything he built, everything he hid, everything he risked for those forbidden moments, could be lost in the blink of an eye. But the despair is not because of him, the betrayed husband, but because of what will come next. If he really knows, if he has discovered everything, what will he do? She knows the man she married well. She is not the type of person who is easily fooled, and the silence that preceded that message only increases the terror she feels. She thinks about calling, but her hands are shaking so much that the cell phone almost slips out of her fingers. The lover, noticing her sudden change, asks her what happened, but she is unable to answer. How could he explain that everything he did was in vain? That the safety she felt in his arms was a fragile illusion, that the real danger wasn't in the discovery, but in what would come after. In her mind, 1,000 scenarios unfold. Her husband standing up to her, exposing the truth, ruining her reputation, her life. But there is something more, something she fears even more than the revelation of her secret. Something that, if he knew, if he really knew, it would be the end for her. After all, when everything seems lost, people do unthinkable things to protect themselves. And her? What will you do when you face the inevitable truth? Life in Philadelphia followed its usual course, with its gray days and cold autumn nights. The streets were filled with the comings and goings of busy people, trapped in their own routines and personal dramas. In the middle of this urban setting, in a middle-class neighborhood, lived the couple formed by John and Emily Carter. Apparently, an ordinary couple, who in the eyes of neighbors and friends, had a stable and comfortable life. But like many things in life, what you saw on the outside was just the surface. John was a 38-year-old man, hardworking, responsible, the kind of person everyone describes as nice. He grew up in Philadelphia and made his career as a manager for a large construction company, a position he had achieved after years of dedication. He was the kind of husband who made an effort to be present, balancing work and home life. But, over the years, routine, pressure and fatigue began to wear him down. John felt like something was missing, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. The feeling that his life was passing by as he watched from the sidelines bothered him deeply, but he didn't know how to express it. Maybe it was the weight of responsibility, maybe it was the emptiness he felt when he returned home, where the connection with Emily seemed further and further away. Emily, on the other hand, was a 35-year-old woman, elegant, with a beauty that effortlessly attracted attention. She had a promising career as a lawyer and spent much of her time in meetings and hearings. To others, Emily was a strong and determined woman, someone who got what she wanted, both at work and in her personal life. But inside, Emily struggled with growing dissatisfaction. She loved John, or at least she believed she did, but something had changed. The years of marriage had transformed the initial passion into a friendly, almost fraternal coexistence. Romantic dinners gave way to monotonous conversations about work and bills to pay. The flame that once united them seemed to have gone out, and Emily felt trapped in a routine that was slowly suffocating her. It was during this phase of dissatisfaction that Emily met Mark, a coworker who awakened feelings in her that had long been dormant. Mark was the opposite of John, extroverted, charming, and with a self-confidence that captivated everyone around him. He was the kind of man who made women laugh and feel special. For Emily, he brought back the excitement and desire she believed she had lost forever. At first, it was just innocent flirting, smiles exchanged during meetings, text messages that started with trivial matters but soon became more personal conversations. Mark knew what he was doing, and Emily, although aware of the risk, played along. She justified her actions by telling herself that she deserved to be happy, that she deserved to feel alive again. Meanwhile, John continued his life without suspecting anything. He believed that problems in marriage were normal, that every couple went through difficult phases. John consoled himself by thinking that, with time, everything would return to normal. He didn't notice the subtle changes in Emily, like the nights she came home late from work, or the smile she wore when looking at her cell phone. He believed it was just the stress of work, and that eventually things would work themselves out. John was not a man who liked confrontations, so he avoided questioning her, preferring to believe that everything was fine. But everything changed on a Friday night. John had planned a surprise for Emily. He wanted to rekindle the marriage flame, try something different. He reserved a table at the restaurant where they had had their first date, a special place that held good memories. When Emily arrived home, John greeted her with a smile and said he had plans for the two of them that night. Emily, however, hesitated. She didn't want to go, but she also couldn't say the real reason. That same night, she had arranged to meet Mark. Trying to hide his nervousness, he made up an excuse about an important office meeting, something that John, always understanding, accepted without question. He smiled, said they could reschedule, and let her go. Emily left the house feeling a mix of guilt and excitement. She knew what she was doing was wrong, but the adrenaline of being with Mark made her feel alive, wanted. At that moment, the last thing she was thinking about was the consequences of her actions. She was trapped in that cycle of lies, without realizing that she was increasingly moving away from John, from the marriage she once valued. John, on the other hand, spent the night alone, reflecting on his marriage. He didn't know what was happening, but something inside him told him something was wrong. It was just a feeling, but it was strong enough to bother him. John had always trusted Emily, never had any reason to doubt her, but that night left a bitter taste in his mouth. He decided he needed to understand what was happening, needed to find out what was wrong. Maybe it was just him, maybe it was his insecurities speaking louder. But the seed of doubt had been planted. And it was this doubt that led him to an unexpected decision. John began to observe Emily more closely, without her noticing. Small details began to emerge, the perfume she didn't wear before, the messages she received and always responded to far from him, the increasingly frequent excuses about work. John felt his heart sink, but he didn't want to believe the worst. Still, he knew he needed to know the truth. The days that followed were a test of his patience. John tried to act like everything was normal, but his anxiety was growing by the minute. He began thinking of ways to discover the truth, of how to confront her without appearing suspicious. But at the same time, I feared what I might find. And it was in this mix of fear and determination that John decided that the only way to discover the truth was on his own. And so, he began to plan his next steps, unaware that he was about to discover something that would change his life forever. That message he would send to Emily, on the night she was with her lover, would be just the beginning of a painful journey full of twists and turns. The tension between John and Emily began to intensify like a storm slowly gathering on the horizon. That marriage, which was previously supported by a predictable routine, became marked by an unsettling silence. Emily, no matter how much she tried to keep up appearances, couldn't hide the changes. Excuses for getting home late became frequent, dates with Mark became increasingly risky, and the guilt that she previously ignored began to take its toll. But still, she continued, as if hypnotized by the adrenaline that betrayal provided. Meanwhile, John continued with his plan. He was not an impulsive man, so he decided to act cautiously. First, he began asking subtle questions, trying to better understand Emily's schedule, the commitments she mentioned, and the colleagues she was supposedly involved with. John knew he couldn't confront her without concrete evidence, so he opted for something more discreet. He hired a private detective. He wanted the truth, but he wasn't prepared for the impact it could have. Still, the decision was made, and there was no turning back. The following weeks were harrowing. John found himself torn between the anxiety of discovering the truth and the fear that his suspicions would be confirmed. He pretended to be normal, but inside, anger and disappointment grew like a shadow he couldn't shake. On his lonely nights, John mentally relived the happy moments he had with Emily, trying to understand where everything had started to fall apart. Was it something he did? Something you didn't do? The questions consumed him, but there were no answers that comforted him. On the other side, Emily was beginning to notice the change in John. He was more distant, more reserved, and his attention always seemed to be elsewhere. But she chose not to care. I was so involved with Mark that problems at home became secondary. The relationship with her lover was all that mattered now. The escapades, the furtive encounters, the feeling of experiencing something forbidden fed a part of her that had long been dormant. Yet there was something about Mark that she couldn't identify, an uneasiness that surfaced whenever he mentioned the future. Emily wasn't prepared to face the reality that this relationship brought, but she also didn't want to give up. The detective hired by John was efficient. It wasn't long before he began sending photos and detailed reports of Emily's encounters. The evidence was there, clear as day. John didn't know how to react when he saw photos of his wife in another man's arms. The pain was unbearable, but with it came a clarity he hadn't expected. The anger, the betrayal, the humiliation, everything was mixed together in his mind, but there was something more, something that bothered him even more than the photos themselves. John knew that for Emily, guilt was inevitable, but why did she still remain so cold and distant? There was something he still couldn't understand. It was then that John decided to confront her, but not directly. He needed to understand how far she would go with that lie. He started playing the same game. He started to be colder, less present, and left Emily alone so she could feel comfortable in his web of lies. John wanted to see how far she would go, how far she was willing to go before admitting the truth. And it was in this process that he noticed something alarming. Emily seemed to be worried about something more than the case itself. There was a tension in her eyes, a fear that John couldn't decipher. The situation reached a critical point on a Saturday morning. John was in the kitchen preparing coffee when Emily came downstairs, visibly upset. She was pale, and her eyes, usually so lively, were dark. Not knowing what to say, John just watched her in silence. He knew something was about to happen, something that would change the course of everything. Emily tried to hide it, but John realized she was hiding something. Emily, at that moment, was fighting her own demons. Guilt was no longer the only problem. She knew her relationship with Mark was becoming more complicated, more dangerous. He had begun to demand more, to pressure her into making decisions she wasn't ready to make. And then, in a desperate attempt to maintain control, Emily made a drastic decision. Pretended to be pregnant. She believed this would give her the power to manipulate the situation, to keep John and Mark under her control, but it backfired. Mark didn't react as she expected, and his coldness scared her. Now, on top of the weight of betrayal, Emily was trapped in an even bigger lie, a lie that could destroy everything. While Emily tried to maintain balance between the two lives she led, John prepared for the final confrontation. He didn't know about the lie about the pregnancy, but he felt like something was about to be revealed. It was like the calm before the storm, and John was ready to face whatever came. The message he would send that night was not just an end point, but the beginning of a truth that would change everything. And so, the tension grew. The truth was about to emerge, and when it did, nothing would be the same. The night that would change everything came sooner than any of them could have imagined. The atmosphere in the Carter house was heavy, as if the walls could feel the tension that hung in the air. Emily could barely stay focused, her mind divided between what she had done and what she needed to do to get out of that situation. She knew she couldn't keep lying forever, but she also wasn't ready to face the truth. John, on the other hand, was calm, almost cold. He had made a decision and nothing would change his mind. Emily had gone out that afternoon to meet Mark for the last time. Her lover was beginning to show a side she didn't know about, a side that scared her. He was impatient, demanding a decision, pressuring her to leave John once and for all. But Emily wasn't ready for that. She liked the security her marriage provided, the comfort her life with John gave her. The problem was that Mark was no longer willing to play second fiddle. He wanted everything or nothing, and Emily, in her desperation, used the pregnancy lie as a last resort. "I need to tell you something," she said to Mark, her voice shaking. They were sitting in his car, parked on a deserted street, far from any prying eyes. Mark, who had been uneasy until then, stopped and looked at her with a suspicious expression. "What is it?" he asked, the tone of his voice colder than ever. Emily hesitated for a moment, but knew she had no other choice. "I'm pregnant, Mark," she said finally, the words coming out softer than she intended. Mark was silent for a long moment, which made Emily even more nervous. "Pregnant?" he repeated, as if the word were something foreign. She nodded, trying to maintain her composure. "Yes, and the baby is yours." The words seemed to resonate inside the car, filling the space between them with an almost palpable tension. But instead of relief, Emily felt a chill run down her spine when she saw Mark's expression change. He didn't look happy, nor surprised. Instead, he laughed. Not a laugh of relief or joy, but a cold laugh, devoid of any emotion. "Do you think I'm going to fall for that?" Mark said, his voice now thick with contempt. "Do you really think I'm going to believe a story like that? How convenient, isn't it? You come out of nowhere with this lie, thinking you're going to tie me to you." Emily tried to defend herself, but the force in her words was gone. "It's not a lie, Mark, I'm telling the truth." But Mark wasn't willing to listen. "Spare me your lies, Emily. If you think this will change my mind, you're sorely mistaken. I'm not an idiot." Mark's response was a hard blow to Emily. She didn't expect that. The man who had been her escape, her safe haven, now treated her like a nuisance. "So what do you want me to do?" she asked, her voice breaking. Mark looked her straight in the eye and said without any hesitation, "You're going to break up with your husband, one way or another. What about this pregnancy thing? If it's true, that's your problem." Emily got out of the car feeling as if the ground had been ripped out from under her feet. The lie, which once seemed like a solution, was now an impossible burden to bear. She needed to think of something, needed to find a way out of this situation before it was too late. But all he could feel was despair creeping into his chest, making each step more difficult than the last. Meanwhile, John was at home, waiting. He knew Emily was away, but what she didn't know was that he had followed her every step. Hiring the detective had been just the beginning. John discovered much more than he wanted. He knew where Emily was, who she was with, and what the nature of that relationship was. But that wasn't what pushed him over the edge. What really hit him was additional information, something he never expected, the lie about the pregnancy. The detective found out everything, and now John knew that Emily was trying to manipulate him. It was the last straw. When Emily finally returned home that night, she found John sitting in the living room, his face hidden in shadows. "We need to talk," he said, in a tone she didn't recognize. He was authoritarian, almost threatening. Emily hesitated, feeling her heart race. She knew something was wrong, but she didn't yet know what. "About what?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. John looked at her for a moment before answering, as if he was weighing every word. "About us. About what's going on with our marriage." Emily felt a chill. She knew she was being confronted, but she didn't know how much John already knew. "John, she started to say, but he interrupted her. "No. I already know everything." His words fell on her like a bucket of cold water. "I know about you and Mark. I know where you've been, what you've been doing. And I know about the pregnancy. Emily froze. She wasn't prepared for this, she didn't know what to say. All he could do was stare at John, waiting for him to continue. But he didn't continue. Instead, John stood up and walked over to her, looking her straight in the eyes. Why did you do this, Emily? I've always been good to you. I've never treated you badly. And yet, you lied, you cheated, and now, you try to manipulate me with a fake pregnancy. The anger in John's voice was unmistakable, but there was also a deep pain. He wasn't just furious, he was devastated. Emily tried to respond, but the words wouldn't come out. She was trapped in her own trap, and now, the only thing she could do was listen. You think I'm an idiot, don't you? John continued, his voice becoming firmer and firmer. Did you think I wouldn't find out? Did you think you could use me as if I were disposable? He laughed, a bitter laugh. Well, now you will listen to me, and you will listen to the end. Emily felt the ground open beneath her feet. He never imagined that John could discover everything, even less so completely and precisely. His every word was a sharp blow to her already weakened defenses. She tried to maintain her composure, but the truth was there, naked and raw, and there was nowhere left to hide. John, I can explain, he began, his voice shaking. But he was not willing to listen to excuses. Explain what, Emily? That you chose to cheat rather than try to fix what was broken. That you chose to lie rather than be honest with me. John was irreducible, his eyes fixed on hers, as if trying to see what was left of that woman he had once been in love with. You destroyed everything we built. And for what? To live a fantasy. To feel alive again. And that lie about being pregnant? What did you think you would gain from that? That I would just accept it without question. Emily felt tears welling up in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. I was confused, she said, in a desperate attempt to justify herself. I didn't know what to do. Mark was pressuring me, and I didn't want to lose you. I thought. John interrupted her with a sharp gesture. What did you think? That you could trap me with a lie? That you could go on living this charade forever? You don't understand, Emily. I would have understood if you had been honest. But now? Now, there's no going back. The silence that followed was suffocating. Emily knew she had lost. He lost not only John, but also control over everything. The lie she had used to try to save herself had ended up destroying her. What are you going to do? She asked, almost in a whisper. John remained silent for a moment before responding. You're going to leave this house. You're going to leave everything behind. I've already filed for divorce. And no, Emily, you're not going to take anything from here. Not money, not possessions. And as for the pregnancy, well, you know that this lie won't help you at all now. Emily felt the weight of his words, like a verdict without appeal. She wanted to fight, she wanted to defend herself, but she had no strength left. Mark was no longer an option. He had made it clear that he had no intention of assuming anything, much less a lie that could cost him dearly. All Emily could think about was the emptiness that opened before her, an abyss of loneliness and regret. John, for his part, was exhausted. He had planned this confrontation many times in his mind, but now that it happened, all he felt was immense sadness. The anger had dissipated, leaving only a bitter emptiness. Emily, I loved you, he said, his voice filled with deep regret. I would do anything to make our marriage work. But you destroyed everything with your lies, your betrayals. And now, there's nothing left to save. Emily wanted to scream, wanted to beg for forgiveness, but she knew it was too late. All she managed was to mumble an apology, which sounded so weak and distant that she didn't even believe it herself. Sorry doesn't change anything, John replied, with a tone that mixed tiredness and resignation. It's too late for us now. That was the last conversation they had as husband and wife. Emily knew she was defeated, that there was nothing more to be said or done. And when John finally turned and left the room, she knew that the most painful chapter of her life had begun. The future that awaited her was bleak, and for the first time, she found herself completely alone, with no one to blame but herself. The silence that fell in the Carter home after that night was almost palpable. Emily retreated to the guest room, unable to face the reality that her marriage was, in fact, over. He heard John's footsteps downstairs, the sound of doors closing, the subtle noises of the house that now seemed to echo his loneliness. But, beyond the silence, there was the weight of the dilemma that now haunted her. With the pregnancy lie revealed and her relationship with Mark falling apart, Emily found herself trapped. His career, built with so much effort, now hung by a thread. If John wanted to, he could expose the whole truth, and that would mean the end of her reputation as a lawyer. The idea terrified her. She was always a woman of control, who prided herself on keeping the reins of her life firmly in her hands. But now, the same hands that once controlled everything were empty, trembling before the abyss that opened before them. John, on the other hand, was trying to process what was left of his emotions. The anger he felt during the confrontation had dissipated, but the hurt remained, relentless. He knew he needed to move on, but there was something that still prevented him from completely closing that chapter. The decision not to expose Emily publicly was, in part, a moral choice. As betrayed as he felt, he didn't want to destroy the woman he once loved. But the dilemma of how to deal with the situation now was overwhelming. John knew he needed to find a way to move forward, but what was fair? As the hours passed through that endless night, John pondered the possibility of confronting Mark. There was no satisfaction in the idea of revenge, but perhaps it was necessary to achieve some kind of closure. However, he knew that this path would not bring the peace he sought. Mark wasn't the only one to blame. He had just taken advantage of a situation created by Emily herself. The real confrontation was internal, a struggle between his desire for justice and his need to find a way to heal the wounds that devastated him. Emily, isolated in her room, reflected on the series of decisions that led her there. She had always prided herself on her intelligence, on her ability to manipulate situations to her advantage, but now she saw herself as the architect of her own downfall. The humiliation of being exposed, the loss of John's respect, Mark's rejection, all of it converged at a point of deep despair. She knew there was no going back, but she also wasn't ready to face the consequences. Every decision made during that period of betrayal now seemed like a wrong choice, a desperate attempt to escape a life that, little by little, had stopped making sense to her. The moral dilemma they both faced was, in a way, a reflection of the complexity of love and betrayal. John needed to decide whether he would adopt a ruthless stance, punishing Emily for her actions, or whether he would let her follow her own path, carrying with her the weight of the choices she made. Emily, in turn, was forced to face the devastation she had caused and consider how to rebuild what was left of her life, if that was even possible. The hours passed until the darkness of night gave way to the gray of dawn. Emily knew she couldn't stay in that house much longer. John's presence, even silent, was a constant reminder of the failure, of the pain she had inflicted. She needed to make a decision, but neither option seemed any less painful. The question was how to find a path where she could redeem herself, or at least survive the weight of her own choices. And John, sitting on the living room sofa, stared into space. He knew that the decision he made in the next few hours would determine not only Emily's future, but his own as well. There was justice in ruining her life, but there was also a heavy price he wasn't sure he wanted to pay. It would be easier to let her go, but that would mean giving up revenge that, in some way, he felt was deserved. What was at stake was more than the end of a marriage, it was a question of principles, of morality, and of how both would deal with the results of their actions. The dilemma was posed, and any decision made at that moment would bring consequences that neither of them could completely predict. The morning dawned cold and foggy, reflecting the heavy atmosphere inside the Carter home. Emily had spent the night awake, tormented by the choices she had made and what she knew was coming. She prepared to leave the house, knowing that it would be the last time she would walk through the door as John's wife. There was an unbearable heaviness to every movement, a feeling that something terrible was about to happen. But still, she gathered what was left of her dignity and walked down the stairs with her suitcase in hand. John was in the kitchen, looking out the window at the empty backyard, an untouched cup of coffee on the table. He didn't look at her when she entered, but he felt her presence. There was a distance between them that seemed impossible to cross. Emily opened her mouth to say something, anything that could soften what was left between them, but the words died before they could be spoken. Instead, the silence spoke for itself. John finally turned to face her, and what he saw was a woman destroyed by her own actions, without any of the lies and manipulations she once wore as armor. "Do you have anywhere to go yet?" he asked, his voice cold but without the harshness of the previous confrontation. Emily nodded, not having the courage to look him in the eye. "I'll stay in a hotel for now. Then I'll think about what to do." There was nothing more to say. John just nodded, and silence once again dominated the house. He didn't wish her good luck, nor did he ask her to stay. They both knew that this was the end, and any attempt to soften the separation would be just another lie. When Emily finally walked out the door, she felt a strange mix of relief and despair. Relief came from the fact that the confrontation was over. The despair, the realization that I had lost everything. She got into the car, started the engine, but didn't drive right away. She stood there, still, allowing herself to cry for the first time in a long time. But the tears brought no comfort, only an emptiness that seemed to grow with each sob. John, still in the kitchen, finally took a sip of his coffee. It was cold, bitter, but he didn't care. He had made his decision and knew it was the right one. There was no more room for resentment, only for the healing process which, he knew, would be long and difficult. What he didn't know was that that morning would bring one last twist. Hours later, already at the hotel, Emily received a call from Mark. She answered, hesitantly, knowing that she could no longer postpone the conversation she had been dreading. "We need to talk," he said, bluntly. "I'll stop by the hotel in an hour." Emily knew that her relationship with Mark was destined to end, but she had no idea how cold he would be. When Mark arrived, he wasted no time beating around the bush. "It's over, Emily. I'm not going to do this anymore." She tried to protest, but Mark was firm. "There is no future for us. You knew that from the beginning. I will not risk my life for a lie you created." Emily was speechless, her face pale and her hands trembling. Mark, without any empathy, got up to leave. Before closing the door, he said one last sentence that left her in pieces: "Mind your own business, Emily. I've already moved on with mine." John, in turn, began to rebuild his life with unexpected calm. The divorce process was quick, as Emily, no longer able to fight, agreed to all of his demands. John sold the house and moved to another city, looking for a new start away from everything that reminded him of his previous life. He wasn't happy, but he felt a strange peace in knowing that the worst was over. Emily, now alone, without Mark, without John, and without the support of her old life, sank into a deep depression. She lost her job, her friends, and was forced to face the consequences of her actions head-on. Without resources, without dignity, and consumed by guilt, Emily was forced to return to her parents' home, something she never imagined would happen. There, she had to face the shame and humiliation of starting over from scratch. John's fate, on the other hand, was more favorable. Over time, he found the strength to move forward, dedicating himself to his work and rebuilding his life. In a new city, far from the shadows of the past, John began to find the peace he had been searching for. He knew the healing process would be long, but he was willing to walk this path. The end came unexpectedly for both. Emily, consumed by her own destruction, was never able to regain what she had lost. John, on the other hand, found a way to free himself from the weight of the past, albeit at the cost of pain he would never forget. And so, the cycle closed, leaving both characters behind, trapped in the consequences of their own choices. What remained was just silence, filled with the bitter lesson that some wounds never heal completely.